It's the DNP Project Podcast with your hosts, Dr. Molly Bradshaw and Dr. Tracy Vitale.
Episode 5, Finding the Problem and Partners as a First Step. In this episode, we're going to discuss how to identify the problem and partners as the first step in completing the DNP project and where you go from there.
So welcome to the DNP Project Podcast, where we share tips, inspiration, and more. My name is Dr. Molly Bradshaw, and I'm the co-host of the show, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Tracy Vitale. Hi, Tracy.
Hi, Molly.
So we're going to talk about the kickoff, getting started and getting engaged with the DNP project. So if you think of football, if you like football, this is the kickoff of the game, right? But there's either two ways this is going to go. A student either needs to find a problem and then find a partner to help execute the problem, or they need to find a practice partner that will help identify a problem. So it can go either way, but the important thing here is that it has to be mutually beneficial to the student and the partnering organization. So that's kind of what we're getting at in this episode. But finding those two pieces is the first thing that has to happen in a DNP project. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. We got to start with the problem.
Yep. So we talked earlier in an episode about students, when they come to us as faculty, we're always hearing students say, for my DNP project, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And students tend to identify an intervention first. And that's really not the right way to go about it. The first thing we're always preaching is that the student has to find a problem, a gap. So it's a better way to reframe and for students to think about a practice problem, because remember, the DNP is a practice-focused degree. So a better way to think about it initially is to reframe and say, I see a problem with blank. I see a gap with blank. This is what should be happening according to the policy, the guideline, the algorithm, but in real world, this is what's happening and there's a gap. Or you might say there could be an opportunity to X, Y, and Z. So as you identify the problem, then the next phase becomes identifying a context. There has to be an organization, a community-based group, a setting, a context. It's really a partner to help execute the problem. Is that what you would agree to?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that when we think about the problems and gaps and opportunities that we have, they're everywhere. We can think about, that it could happen in a healthcare setting. It could happen in a community-based setting. Any of those are possibilities where we have the potential to improve the healthcare, improve our patients' health and well-being. I think that what students also want to keep in mind when they're thinking about identifying the problem is think of one that's going to be relevant to them in their future career. How can they take this problem and really allow it to help develop them as a nurse with a practice doctorate degree? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, as you said that, I was thinking the idea of an organization, a partnering organization. At my school, we've had a lot of debate about what does an organization mean? Like, what does that mean? And we kind of decided on the definition that an organization is any entity that's involved in some aspect of the delivery of healthcare. So that might be a school system. It might be a religious entity. It might be the traditional hospital or clinic or that type thing. It might be the Boys and Girl Scouts of America. It might be 4-H. There's just a ton of ways that it can look. But an organization is just really any group that is involved or could be involved with the delivery of healthcare to a patient or population group. So that might be a
Absolutely.
helpful way to think about identifying a partner in this.
Absolutely. And when you're thinking about identifying that partner, we've mentioned before, you want that partnering organization to have value in the problem that you've identified. Because, we want to create a relationship that's going to be beneficial and a positive working relationship. And the only way for that to happen is for both you as the student, or the student that you're advising, and the intended organization to both have a vested interest in the success of the student project.
I think one of the challenging things that you're really going to have to negotiate as a student. So if I have a problem that I'm passionate about and I go to the organization to pitch my idea, or even to see if the organization is interested in working on a project together, there's different, I'm going to have an elevator speech. I'm going to talk to people differently within that organization. So talk to us about how that conversation might look in that initial stage.
Well, sure. When I think it's important for us to recognize that we have to think of the currency of the person that we're talking to, right? And I don't mean currency money. I mean, what's their value? What's their perspective on it? Why should the person I'm talking to care about my problem that I've identified, whether it's self-identified or, the chief nursing officer said, hey, we're dealing with this issue. Can you help us out with it? The way we talk to stakeholders is different based on what their role is. The way my 3-minute elevator speech to the chief nursing officer about a specific problem is going to be very different than the elevator speech about my project that I give to the chief financial officer. Correct. Which is also going to be very different than the elevator speech that I give to the providers or practitioners or the frontline staff that I'm looking to help execute the practice change. It's just finding those areas that are important to them. For example, if I'm looking to improve CAUTI and CLABSI rates in an ICU setting, when I speak to the CNO, I'm thinking in terms of quality and safety of the patients, okay? When I'm speaking to the CFO, I may be thinking about penalties that the hospital incurs because of failing to meet benchmarks. When I speak to the nurses and the staff about why they should want to change their practice based on what I'm looking to do for my project, what are they going to get out of it, out of doing my project? Well, if we can decrease infection rates, they won't need to be on our unit as long, and then maybe we won't have we won't have the nurse-patient ratio that we have because we're able to keep our patients healthy and get them out in a timely fashion. So it's all the same project, but I have to focus on different aspects of the implications of the project depending on who I'm speaking to. I always go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, once this buy-in occurs, let's say that I'm a student and I've sort of got a problem in mind and I go to a partnering organization and I pitch my idea to the different stakeholders and that goes well. In my experience, one of the next things, like let's just say, for example, the organization says, yes, we're interested in a project around the topic that you're interested in. And you say, okay, great. I think the next piece that the student has to be prepared to negotiate is timelines, because often the organizational timeline, when they agree to something, they want it done right then, fast. They're really excited. They're very enthused. And so what the student needs to know is that academic timelines, this is an academic experience, it's a learning experience. So one of the things you need to be very transparent about, and you need to negotiate ahead of time, is the timeline of the organization and how that compares to the academic timeline that a student is going to follow. Because, for example, if the student has not taken their DNP project planning class yet, they haven't really got the skills yet to, if they haven't cleared the IRB, so there's a lot of things that have to happen on the academic side. And so it may be necessary for the student, once they get that initial, yes, we're interested, first just talk to the organization about maybe what kind of timeline they're looking at, and then take that information back to the faculty and let the faculty advise on what the academic timeline is going to look like. Or maybe you do that ahead of time, but there has to be really a negotiation of the timeline. It's the number one frustrating thing that will happen if you don't do it appropriately, that the organization will want to move faster than the academic process will allow. Has that been your experience too?
Absolutely. And I have something else to add on that. But before I get there, I want to be able to focus on that conversation is critically important. I cannot stress it enough. It's part of being a leader. Becoming a DNP, you're going to be a leader in the profession. You're going to be expected to lead our profession in some capacity. And, one of my famous sayings that students always hear me saying is, you have to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And that can be an uncomfortable conversation. If they've identified it as a problem, especially if they are the originators, the project site is the originator in identifying what the problem is, they tend to want action immediately. And we have to be willing to say, I'm all in, I'm glad you have something and that you're willing to work with me, but please recognize that I have some constraints that I'm working under as well. Let's find a way to make that work for both of us. So that way there's some upfront and honest dialogue. Again, it helps avoid any issues on the back end that they're frustrated with you because it's taking so long, but that's because we never had the conversation ahead of time to say, well, here's where I am in my course sequencing, and here's where we expect, the timing of things to work out. In addition to the timeline conversation, another challenge that students tend to face is sometimes project sites get super excited about the project and want to make it much more than what it needs to be. And sometimes we have conversations with students, this project doesn't have to be your life's work. It's certainly going to provide that foundation for future scholarship for you, but you don't have to do it all just in order to graduate. So take off, a manageable bite of what you can work on, and meet the expectations of your college or university to meet the requirements of having completed the DNP project, and establish that plan for sustainability where the facility can then say, this is great, this is a great starting point, and now we've got a little bit of a feeder system going where other students can come in and continue to expand upon that. I think that those 2 points of the timeline and the manageability of a reasonably sized project are critical conversations to be having with potential partners, because we want you to graduate.
Oh yeah. And the words that I sometimes use for that is feasibility and how a project might be scaled or phased. I think I've observed students getting panicky that somebody's going to steal their idea, or that somebody, that what if the organization does take off and say, yeah, we want a new nurse mentorship program, so let's do it. And then the student's like, but that was what I was going to do. So a couple of things on that point. Number one, if an organization does for some reason take off on a project, just because a project takes off doesn't mean that it's going to last, doesn't mean that it doesn't need revision, doesn't mean that it doesn't need refocusing. So maybe if a project takes off, the student can negotiate coming into maybe phase 2 of the project, or a later aspect of the project. So they're not in on the ground, the liftoff, but they might be involved in the 1-year evaluation of the program, or they might be involved in the 2-year evaluation or something like that. So that's one way to kind of not lose heart that it's a totally lost cause. Again, it's just something that you've got to negotiate. And the other thing, to a great point that you're talking about, I think it really, the faculty will guide and recommend in terms of, you're right, it doesn't have to be your life's work, but maybe there's an arm or an aim or an element that you can be clearly in charge of as a contributing factor or something like that. So there is often ways to stage projects, phase projects, roll things out in chunks, and the chunk could be someone's DNP project, and then maybe the second chunk is someone else's DNP project. So those are all things to keep in mind as we're negotiating with potential organizations and potential partners.
Absolutely, definitely.
So, and again, in some DNP programs, topics are assigned, organizational partners are assigned to students. In other programs, they get to choose. And I would say in a good majority of DNP programs, students complete their projects in the organizations that they work for, or for their employers, in some way. So there's a lot of different ways that can look. But if you still feel stuck on the idea of getting your problem, identifying a partner, and our workbook that we've partnered with this Springer, the DNP Project Workbook, a step-by-step process for success, there are some exercises, some activities that you can do to really help with the brainstorming process. So brainstorming, I think, is a real critical activity. So there's some of that content that can kind of help a student think through, what would this look like? What would that look like? And then kind of narrow it down to a best idea. That's sort of what you and I have done a lot in our boot camp series, of helping students kind of work through that. But it's a necessary thinking process that has to go on. And I would argue it's one of the more difficult parts of the project, is getting a problem, identifying the partner, and then getting it narrowed down to something that's feasible.
Right.
And on the timeline, on everybody's timeline, we can't say timeline enough.
Absolutely.
So this kind of wraps up the first of our 5 episodes of our podcast. So we're hoping that you like the podcast. If you do, give us some feedback, give us some review. You can find us in a couple of different places. Tracy, tell us where we can be found.
Okay, so on Twitter, we are at DNP Success. We're on Instagram, DNP Success. We've got email available, dnpsuccess@gmail.com. You're probably seeing a trend here with our name. And we've got a YouTube channel, so check out DNP Success. And if you are listening to our podcast, you can check out YouTube and actually see what we look like. So we're really excited about this. We hope that you share the information and let others know, and let us know what else we can do to help meet your needs as you prepare for completing a project, or helping others, helping students complete a DNP project. So check it out. We're looking forward to some future episodes with more tips. We want to inspire you. We want to bring in some other experts and interview them and ask them about their stories, their experiences. We want to bring in some other experts and talk about some emerging ideas beyond the DNP project. So we're really excited about where this is going to take us. So come along with us on the journey.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Molly Bradshaw and Dr. Tracy Vitale on the DNP Project Podcast. check out the DNP Project YouTube channel at DNP Success on YouTube.